Sarah and Jacob had always been open-minded, their relationship built on trust and experimentation. They'd been together for 5 years, and, after much discussion, they decided to explore the world of swinging, meeting strangers and testing boundaries. The first few experiences were exciting, thrilling even. They found a rhythm, a sense of freedom they had never known before. But things began to change when they met a couple named Lisa and Mark. At first, it was just another meetup, a casual exchange. Lisa and Mark were charming, funny, and confident, but something about them was different, an intensity that was hard to ignore. Jacob felt a strange connection with Lisa, while Sarah found herself both intrigued and unsettled by Mark's possessive gaze. One night, the four of them decided to meet at Sarah and Jacob's apartment. It was supposed to be just a fun evening, but things quickly took a turn. There was an undeniable chemistry in the air, but it wasn't the kind Sarah and Jacob were used to. Lisa and Mark didn't seem to be there for the same reasons. They were there to control, to manipulate. Jacob, caught in a web of desire and confusion, found himself alone with Lisa in the bedroom. It felt like they were being watched, though no one else was in the room. Meanwhile, Sarah sat with Mark in the living room, feeling a gnawing sense of unease. The evening began to take on a darker tone as Lisa whispered things to Jacob that made him question everything. She spoke of secrets, power dynamics, and a game she had been playing for much longer than anyone realized. As Sarah and Mark shared a drink, the atmosphere grew colder. Mark, too, had a glint in his eye, a knowing, almost predatory look. Sarah, uneasy, stood up to leave, but when she tried, the door wouldn't open. She was locked in. Panic set in as the air grew heavier and the laughter from the bedroom turned into something more sinister. Sarah rushed to check on Jacob, but when she opened the door, she found him not quite himself. His eyes were wide, unfocused, like he was in a trance. Mark stood behind her, blocking the doorway, a smirk on his face. "You should have known better than to invite people into your world without understanding the consequences," he said, his voice low. The night spiraled from there. Sarah and Jacob were trapped in their own home, caught between manipulation and control. What started as an adventure had turned into a nightmare, and the line between trust and betrayal had blurred beyond recognition. They would never forget the night everything went wrong. The couple they thought they could trust had their own twisted agenda, and Sarah and Jacob would never be the same. The silence after Mark's cryptic words was deafening. Sarah felt her pulse hammering in her chest as she tried to think of a way out. Mark stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the dimly lit hallway. "You see, Sarah," he continued, his voice eerily calm, "we don't just swing for fun. We swing for control, for power. And tonight, you gave us both." Sarah's heart raced as she stepped backward into the room, instinctively reaching for Jacob. But when she looked at him, she saw a man she barely recognized. His face was pale, his body rigid, and his eyes stared blankly at the floor. Lisa stood behind him, her hand resting possessively on his shoulder, a triumphant smile on her face. "What did you do to him?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling. Lisa tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh, Jacob? He's just seeing things our way now. Don't worry, darling, he's fine, for now." Sarah clenched her fists, anger overtaking her fear. "Let him go. This isn't what we agreed to." Mark laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that sent chills down her spine. "Agreements mean nothing in our game. You invited us into your lives, and now we're here to stay." As Sarah's desperation grew, she noticed subtle changes in the apartment. The lights seemed dimmer, the walls closer. Even the air felt heavier, as though the space itself had turned against her. She realized too late that Lisa and Mark hadn't just walked into their lives. They had brought something with them, something dark. Lisa stepped forward, her eyes glinting with malice. "You and Jacob were so eager to explore, but you never thought to ask what happens when you go too far, did you?" What do you mean? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark smirked. There's a cost to letting people into your world, Sarah. A cost you're now paying. Tonight you gave us your trust, and with it, your freedom. Lisa's grip tightened on Jacob's shoulder, and he flinched, as if struggling against an invisible force. It's not just about the thrill, Lisa added. It's about dominance, control, and once we have it, we don't let go. Sarah knew she had to act fast. Whatever Lisa and Mark had planned, it wasn't going to end well for her or Jacob. She scanned the room for anything she could use as a weapon, her mind racing. Then she saw it. The antique mirror Jacob had inherited from his grandmother, propped up in the corner of the bedroom. Something about its reflective surface seemed off, as though it held secrets of its own. Taking a deep breath, Sarah lunged for the mirror. Lisa's laughter turned to a scream as Sarah yanked it off the wall and held it up. The room seemed to shudder as the mirror's surface reflected the sinister pair. For a moment, their confident facades faltered, and their true forms flickered into view, distorted, shadowy figures with hollow eyes and jagged smiles. "Stop!" Lisa shrieked, her voice losing its human tone. "You don't know what you're doing." But Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned the mirror toward Jacob, who gasped as if waking from a nightmare. The fog in his eyes cleared and he stumbled backward, breaking free from Lisa's grip. "What's happening?" he stammered, his voice hoarse. "No time to explain," Sarah said, grabbing his hand. "We have to go. Now." As Sarah and Jacob bolted for the door, Mark lunged at them, his once charming features twisted with rage. "You can't leave," he roared. "We're not done with you yet." Sarah swung the mirror in his direction, and the force of its reflection sent him reeling, his figure distorting and fading as though being sucked into the glass. Lisa screamed, but her voice was cut off as Sarah turned the mirror on her as well. The room trembled violently, and with a deafening crack, both Lisa and Mark vanished, their forms swallowed by the mirror's surface. The apartment fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the air felt normal again. Sarah and Jacob stood frozen, the mirror still clutched in Sarah's hands. Its surface was no longer reflective, but opaque, like a pool of black ink. Days later, Sarah and Jacob sat in a cafe, their hands intertwined. They had survived, but the scars of that night remained. They decided to leave the swinging lifestyle behind, vowing never to let strangers into their lives again. The mirror, however, was another story. Unable to destroy it, they locked it away in a storage unit far from their home. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would dream of Lisa and Mark, their hollow eyes staring out from the glass, waiting for another chance to return. In the weeks following that fateful night, Sarah and Jacob tried to resume their lives. They moved to a new apartment, far away from the memories of Lisa and Mark. They never spoke of the mirror or the events of that night, fearing that even mentioning it might bring the horrors back. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, and strange, cold drafts would pass through the room, even when the windows were closed. Jacob dismissed it as lingering trauma, but Sarah knew better. The mirror wasn't just a portal, it was a prison, and Lisa and Mark were still inside, waiting. One evening, Sarah returned home late from work to find Jacob sitting in the living room, staring at something on the coffee table. Her blood ran cold when she saw what it was, the mirror. "I locked that away," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How did it get here?" Jacob didn't respond. His face was pale, his eyes vacant. He was muttering under his breath, too low for Sarah to understand. She reached out to touch him, but the moment her fingers brushed his shoulder, he jerked upright, his eyes locking onto hers. "They're coming back," he said, in a voice that wasn't his own. "You can't keep them locked away forever." Sarah stumbled backward, her heart pounding. The mirror's surface had returned to its reflective state, but something was wrong. Instead of her own reflection, she saw Lisa and Mark staring back at her, their faces twisted into mocking smiles. "You thought you could escape us?" Lisa's voice echoed from the glass. "You brought us into your lives, and now we're part of you. Forever." Sarah knew she couldn't let this continue. She grabbed a heavy blanket and covered the mirror, but the laughter continued, growing louder and more sinister. Jacob collapsed to the floor, writhing as if something was trying to pull him into the mirror's grasp. Desperate, Sarah remembered the antique shop where Jacob had originally purchased the mirror. The owner, an eccentric old woman named Eleanor, had mentioned something cryptic about its history. "It reflects more than just your face. It reflects your soul." Sarah wrapped the mirror in the blanket, ignoring the muffled screams and whispers emanating from it, and drove to the shop. The place was closed for the night, but Sarah banged on the door until Eleanor appeared, her expression grim. "You brought it back," Eleanor said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "I told you to be careful." "Please," Sarah begged. "They're trapped inside. My husband he's—" "I know," Eleanor interrupted. "This mirror doesn't just reflect souls, it steals them. And those two you speak of, they've been playing this game for decades, moving from couple to couple, taking what isn't theirs." Eleanor led Sarah to a back room, where a circle of runes was etched into the floor. "This is the only way to banish them," she said, "but it will cost you." "What kind of cost?" Sarah asked, fear creeping into her voice. Eleanor didn't answer. Instead, she gestured for Sarah to place the mirror in the center of the circle. The old woman began chanting in a language Sarah didn't recognize. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and Lisa and Mark's faces appeared again, their expressions furious. "You can't do this," Lisa screamed. "You invited us. You wanted us." The room shook violently, and Sarah felt an invisible force pulling her toward the circle. She dug her heels into the ground, clinging to the edge of a table as the mirror's surface began to crack. Eleanor's chanting grew louder, and with a deafening shatter, the mirror exploded, sending shards flying across the room. When the dust settled, the room was silent. The mirror was gone, reduced to nothing but dust. Jacob lay unconscious on the floor, but when Sarah rushed to his side, he opened his eyes, his gaze clear and focused. "It's over," Eleanor said, her voice weary. "But you'll carry their scars forever. Be careful who you trust from now on." Sarah and Jacob never spoke of the mirror again. They moved to a new city, far from the memories of that night, and started fresh. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would catch a glimpse of her reflection in a window or a puddle, and for a split second, she thought she saw Lisa and Mark staring back at her, their hollow eyes filled with rage. Though the mirror was gone, its curse had left a mark, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.